our special guest today is Jp Behrens. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the horror genre.
Um, well, a little bit about myself is I kind of fell into writing by dumb luck and unfortunate circumstances because it's very tough to make a living as a writer. But I got into horror actually because I was going to a lot of sci-fi fantasy conventions, one of which was Dragon Con in Atlanta, Georgia.
Yeah.
And I met a bunch of writers and we got to talking and they told me about this convention in the Northeast, the New England area called Nikon. I went to that, talked to some more people, and those people happened to be horror publishers, and I kind of just fell into it. That was who was buying my stuff initially. So that's where I ended up.
So what drew you to the horror genre specifically?
um I don't know. I just, what it is ultimately I just really like telling stories. It's not so much the horror genre pulls me more than any other one. But I do really dig the idea of, you know, having people confront different kind of fears, different kind of concerns in a safe way that they can process it. And I can try to, and it's kind of interesting to try and scare the bejesus out of people without turning them off from the story.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, especially with extreme horror and even psychological horror, how far can you take it before you turn someone off, and can you pull them back in if you're right at that edge? So it's a cool little puzzle to play around with psychologically, which I have fun with.
What kind of which sort of subgenre do you like working in the most? Because I know you just mentioned extreme and psychological horror.
I'm back to, I love stories, so I don't know there's a subgenre that I like the most. I'm easily bored, so I bounce around a lot.
Yeah.
I love doing mashups. I love doing quiet horror, existential horror, fantasy, magical realism. I jump around so much because if I don't, I get really bored and the writing becomes really stale for me. So it's really important for me to focus more on the plot and the characters and the story rather than the genre.
Yeah.
I ultimately just end up writing dark stuff. It just ends up where it goes.
So are you a plotter or a pantser?
I am a plotter all the way.
Do you do the same with characters?
Um, I plot the plot. I plot the story itself and the turns and things like that. By the time I sit down and write the character, by the time I start writing and then when I'm writing the plot, I kind of let the characters develop over time. And by the end of my first draft, I've usually got a really good idea of who my characters are. And then when I go back in second draft, I focus on making sure that my character arcs are on point and that my characters' voices are fairly consistent throughout the story.
Yeah. So have you ever based any stories or characters on yourself or any of your fears?
Oh yeah, tons. Was it for Portrait of a Nuclear Family? That came out of, I had my first kid, and you hold that first baby in your arms and you think, I would burn the world down for you.
Yeah.
And I then my brighter brain kicks in and says, but what could your kid have to do in order for you to not abandon them, but definitely look at them differently? And that kind of sparked the idea. And then I just took it. I was like, this is horrific. How can I make it worse? And then if that's the worst I can do, how can I make it even worse than that? And I just kept taking it to a darker and darker and darker place. And it became, a parent's worst nightmare sort of thing. And then add in, my own troubles and my own struggles with mental health and things like that. And you get this just crazy roller coaster story of someone dealing with the worst possible situation any parent can deal with while also suffering from a really severe mental illness.
Yeah. So did you find that helped writing it all down?
According to my friends and the people who know me best and have read most of my stuff, since I've written Portrait, they say I have mellowed out quite a bit.
Yeah.
So apparently I'm not as angry as I once was. I got some things out of my system, it seems.
Yeah. If your friends and your family have picked up on that, then you must have.
Yeah.
So do you kind of put any messages in your work, whether you're meaning to or not?
I think that's I think you can't not put a message in your work. Yeah, I definitely do. But for me, that's what makes his story interesting is both the character development, the character narrative, and the plot narrative working together to tell a story that has some kind of meaning to it. I think the best stories are trying to say something.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm definitely and looking at my old work, my past work versus my recent work, I noticed that the work that people gravitate towards more and tend to have a stronger reaction to are the ones where I focused more on character development and emotional through lines where I'm trying to say something about something really small, maybe that people have a much deeper response to it. So I think, I think when you write, though, the more you do it, you're going to eventually put your thoughts and your ideas into it.
Mm.
But at the same time, you're a fiction author. You're also going to be representing other ideas that you may not necessarily agree with. I mean, I don't agree with everything Wanda did in Portrait of a Nuclear Family, but at the same time, her extreme reactions and the things I wrote are kind of a commentary on people always trying to present always try or worry more about presenting themselves rather than being themselves.
Yeah.
So,
that's right. A lot of people think about more what other people think about them, don't they, rather than what they should think about themselves.
Absolutely.
So what's been the hardest thing about writing in the horror genre?
The hardest thing, I don't know. I don't know that I think, maybe getting into the headspace of certain darker characters, that definitely doesn't make it easy. Like people keep asking, occasionally I have readers ask me, like, when is there going to be a sequel to Portrait? And I just keep saying, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure I can really get myself into that headspace again. It was dark. And again, I worked a lot of stuff out with that book.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the harder things is also when you make a villain or you make somebody who's an antagonist, you have to make it so that antagonist has a point of view that the reader can agree with to a point, or at least see and understand. They're not evil for evil's sake. They're evil because they believe this is the best way to make the world a better place or to do something that they feel would be the best thing to do in that moment. So you have to really go kind of dark and think like, well, why would this person think what they're doing is a good idea to begin with? And that's a little difficult sometimes, depending on the character and the villain and what you're doing.
Yeah. So what's been the most difficult scene you've ever had to write?
I think some of anytime I've had to harm a child, those are a little rough. There were scenes in Portrait where I had to hurt animals, and those were a little rough. And the way I kind of got through them was I wrote them very clinically. I was like reporting them in a newspaper sort of thing. I didn't try to go too crazy with it.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that actually made it worse because people just read this very matter of fact list of like, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. And people kind of populated the scene themselves with the worst possible things they could think of. Generally, anytime I write about someone suffering mental illness and they have to get really introspective and think about the world and their place in it, that can sometimes be really hard because, you have some little, you end up having a little transference with your own mental health and your own feelings of whether or not you belong in the world, whether or not what you're doing is the right thing. And, this writing gig, am I doing the right thing? Writing's already full of a ton of anxiety. And now I'm going to add to that anxiety by writing about anxiety.
This is right, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
So do you ever feel any sort of like remorse for putting your readers through such
No.
No.
God, no. No, you bought my book. I put a trigger warning in the book. You knew what you were getting into. No. Zero remorse.
So what's been your most memorable pieces of feedback?
Oh man, a lot actually. God, yeah. So there's one of the best pieces of advice I probably got. Both, actually, two pieces of advice I got came from a comic book artist by the name of Brian Stelfreeze. And at the time, I was trying to sell a script for a graphic novel. And I still have it, and I'm still trying to find a buyer, but or at least an artist to work on with it. And and he came back and he read the script, and he came back to me and he said, "So here's the thing. Your dialogue is beautiful. It's like a ballet. Everybody's moving and it flows and this and that and the other thing." And I go, "Oh, well, great." And he's like, "No, that's wrong. Don't write like that." And I went, "What do you mean?" He says, "Dialogue should be a sword fight. Each person in that conversation has a goal. And their goal is to get their way. And while they're talking, they're trying to parry and deflect and stab and force the other person to see things their way. They should not just be sitting there and agreeing and flowing back and forth with wittiness. There needs to be some kind of conflict within the dialogue." And that changed the way I write dialogue a great deal.
Yeah.
And the other thing he had said was, it was the dialogue, and then it was, and then he was like, everything you write essentially should be reflective of the human condition. You're talking, every comic, everything, every good story reflects the universality of the human condition. And I was like, okay. And those are two things I took to heart, and I've tried to keep going with as I write and keep developing. And the one big thing I'm developing now is, placing emotional through lines into my stories, because that's a good way to get readers to stick to.
Okay, fantastic. So how do you think the horror genre is evolving?
I think it's evolving as anything does. There's going to be changes. There's going to be growing pains. There's going to be shifts. I don't think as the authors and as the artists, we really have a say in how the genre grows ultimately and how it changes and morphs and evolves. I think that's up to the readers. It's the same thing for any book you put out there. You can promote it, you can dump money into advertising, but unless you put something out that people want to read, enjoy, talk about, there's very little you can do to force success, unless you're going to, drop $300,000 on your own book and just buy a warehouse full of them to force your name onto the New York Times bestseller list. But I think horror's going along fine. I don't really see any problems with it. I think the biggest problem right now is the debate over trigger warnings and the fact that a lot of people are very adamantly against them and others are adamantly for them. And then there's the people in the middle who kind of like, well, give or take it. And I think it's a silly argument to have ultimately. I think it's just put the trigger warnings on there and look at it as another bit of marketing. I know readers who open books up and look for trigger warnings to give them reasons to read the book. And I know people who, we don't look at soldiers who have PTSD and they freak out from like a backfiring car and go, "Oh, you're so weak." It's the same thing with a book. You're reading a story and it triggers a it triggers a reaction that makes you relive a harmful incident in your life. I don't want to do that to people. I have no remorse running my readers through the ringer. I would have remorse if I caused somebody to have a mental breakdown because I didn't put a warning in there for things that I know are going to trigger people that are big triggers. Mental abuse, physical abuse, and animal cruelty. They're big ones. They're things that are pretty easy, and rape. Those are things that are just easy to just say, hey, this happens. And I don't have to give too much away from the story. I can just be like, this is what goes on. I don't need to go into severe detail of every horrific thing that happens in the book. I just need to hit those points that I know people suffer, who don't want to relive those moments and suffer from it. So I think it's look at it as marketing, look at it as avoiding 1-star reviews as most as you can. And then also look at it as there are people who are looking for books that specifically have that in there. And that's just another piece of advertising that they'll see and go, oh, I want to read this book. Because I know that I've met and talked to readers who are like that. Yeah.
I think that's just going to be one of those arguments that's never really going to be settled, isn't it?
Probably, yeah. I think it's a debate that will go on and on forever. And I kind of am like, this is my opinion. Here it is. I'm done. I'm not going into I'm not going into a massive argument over it. I was like, this is my opinion. And that's the way I present. That's the way I manage my books. And I'm good with that. And beyond that, if I provide the trigger warning, I'm good with it. It's when people say, "Oh, this should have had a trigger warning." I'm like, "It did, page 3." I don't know what you were doing. I don't know what you were looking at, but it was there.
So, if you were to give somebody some advice on writing in the horror genre, what would it be?
In any genre, horror, whatever, any advice on writing. I got 2 pieces, and I say these 2 things all the time. The first one is, whenever you ask somebody the question, what is the best piece of advice you can give a new writer? I also say, amend that question by saying, other than read all the time, write all the time. Those are the 2 most popular answers to that question because they're the 2 best answers to that question. Internalize those 2 things and do them. Number 2 is have perseverance. A lot of the time, writing is a matter of practice and perseverance. Push through the rejections, push through the self-doubt, keep working on your stories, keep reading new stuff, just keep pushing, because there are stories of people with overnight success, and there are people who have been doing this. I have been writing in some fashion for the last 20 years. In the last year, when I started doing like everything, like really full-time hard on it, that's when I started to find success. But it was 20 years of me making a lot of mistakes and writing a lot of really bad stuff, right? Really bad stories, to finally get to a point where I kind of understand how to build a story. I understand how to create flow. I understand how to create character arc. I've got my fundamentals down, that now I'm in a place where I can sell books and I can get people to buy my work. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a ton of perseverance. So you just need to buckle down and do the work, and eventually something will click. And, just keep reading. I know some people hate craft books, but there are some really good craft books out there. Read a couple of them. If you go to my website, I list a bunch that I think are great. And then, and just keep going at it, keep submitting, keep going, talk to people, have friends read, and make sure you get people who are going to be super honest with you, and when they're honest with you, don't get mad. It sucks. It hurts to be told, oh, this isn't really great, I didn't really like it. But make sure you get them to tell you why, because the why is the bigger part. That's the most important thing, because then you have something that you can work on.
Yeah. I mean, some people get rejections, don't they? And then it completely puts them off writing.
Oh, yeah.
And everything.
Absolutely.
I think as well, a lot to do with that is because they haven't been told why it's not been accepted.
Yeah, that's rough. And the annoying thing about that is that sometimes they don't really have a good reason. Most magazines, like if you have to think of it this way, professional magazines are getting thousands of submissions a month, if not a week, depending on the one. And these are like the pro rate. These are the pro paying guys. They're getting thousands and they maybe publish 2 or 3 stories a month, maybe. And that's that from the open call. Some of their stuff, they're actually calling more established writers and saying, hey, can you write a story for us? So that's the big one. And then you go down to semi-pro, they're still getting thousands. They're not getting as many as pro, but they're certainly getting thousands. So again, they're looking for certain things, and it needs to fit the specific theme that they might be doing that month, or the specific voice that they do for that magazine. And there's so many just random reasons why your story's not getting picked up. Sometimes it's just like, I liked it. It was well done, but I just don't think it fits. And it just didn't pull me in. And you're like, okay, and you move on. And then you get down to Token, and then Token, they're still getting hundreds of submissions, and you're going to go through them, and you just kind of work your way down the list. And eventually, whenever you get that rejection, you go over the thing and you go over your piece and you look at it and you try to identify where are the slow bits, what didn't catch their attention. Was it the beginning hook? Was it the middle? Was my ending off? Did it not make sense to the overall story? You look at it, you keep re-looking at it, you hand it to friends that you trust, and you just constantly keep working it. In the meantime, write a new story. While you're submitting, write new stuff. I guarantee you the next thing will be marginally better than the first one. And then the one after that will be marginally better. And as you're going, you get 15, 20 stories in. That 20th story, you might actually get a semi-pro sale. That's kind of how my career's been. I got Token sales first, and then I worked my way up to semi-pro sales. And I'm slowly working my way towards pro rate sales. But even when you sell a pro rate story, you're still going to probably sell semi-pro again, because there's just not that many pro paying magazines accepting stories. They just don't accept enough stories.
Yeah.
So yeah, that rejection sucks, but ultimately you have to try to remember that there are so many weird reasons why they reject the story, and they don't often mean that your story was poorly written. Sometimes it does, but not often. And again, you have resources, you have people online that you can talk to, contact them. A lot of authors are willing to maybe read a story from you, as if they're not I'm not talking like Stephen King or Neil Gaiman, but me and other smaller authors will sometimes be like, yeah, sure. Sometimes they'll have to say no for legal reasons. It depends. But go to conventions, talk to authors, see if some of them are willing to take a look at one of your short stories, and they'll give you an honest reaction. You may not like it, but it's an honest one. My first novel, I actually seeked out editing from the professional editor and novelist, and the feedback I got back put me off of writing for 3 months, because it was just so debilitatingly honest. But 3 months later, I was like, you know what? I still really want to do this. I still really want to be a writer. So I went back, I reread the feedback, and then I got back to work. So you need to kind of toughen up and take the hits, and then go, okay, I learned that lesson, time to move on.
I suppose seeing that feedback for the first time, you're like, oh my God. And then going back to it with a fresh set of eyes, you can actually sit down and read it properly.
Yeah, well, it was funny because after I got the feedback, it took me probably another few years before I went back to that book and looked at it and went, oh yeah, this book needs a full rewriting. And it was after I'd written another book, and I'd written another a bunch more short stories. And I read so many. I read and I wrote so much that 2 years later I had improved without actively taking lessons or to actively taking classes. And I just from writing a bunch and reading a bunch, when I went back and looked at that piece 2 years later, I was like, oh yeah, this this is garbage. I need to rewrite this thing. So again, it's like without even trying, if you just keep at it and you keep writing new stuff, eventually, and again, reading a ton, you'll get there. You'll start kind of putting it together. Sometimes it's a game. I just recently listened to an interview from Jim Butcher, who does Dresden Files. And even he was like, it's a perseverance game. You just keep at it. Eventually a spot opens. And if you kept at it and you kept working and you kept developing your skills, you happen to be the guy that has the best skills at that time that you get that spot. And now you've got your foot in the door, and now you got to like keep going.
Yeah, that's right. So do you have any exciting projects that you're currently working on?
Absolutely. Currently, I am putting together a self-published collection of all my short fiction, all the old bad stuff and all the new good stuff, and up to you to decide which is which. And that is, my plan is to have that out at the end of March, beginning of April. That will be specifically releasing at, if I can manage it, will be specifically releasing at the Scares That Care AuthorCon in Virginia. It's in Williamsburg, Virginia, I believe.
Yeah,
I'd have to look it up again. But it's if you go to scaresthatcares.com, you can find links to AuthorCon and get tickets. I'll be having that there. I'll have that there. That'll be new for that. And then next summer, around July, maybe August, we're still trying to work out the actual release date on that. I will be releasing a novella. Hopefully, I'm finishing it up now, and I got to submit it to the publisher. So once that is all said and done, I'll make a bigger announcement about it. But I have a novella coming that I'm working on, and that'll be part of a series. So that'll be followed up by a couple more novellas, as long as I don't, as long as I don't like blow up and fall apart in the next few months, those will happen, And then I've got a young adult fantasy out to agents. So I'm waiting until an agent shows some faith in me, and then that'll hopefully be in the works. And that's also a series. So if I can get these things moving along, I got a lot of projects coming up, and then I've got a few new things that I'm starting to plan.
Fantastic. Where can we find your books?
My books are on Amazon. Yeah, all my stuff is on Amazon. You can special order it through Barnes & Noble, but because it's KDP, they will not bring them into the store without, special order. But you can get them on Amazon, and you can get my books signed from my website. It's jpbehrensauthor.com. And I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on everything. Goodreads, I'm all over the place. I rarely am in there, but if you message me, I'll eventually get back to you. And then I got shows. If you go to my website, I have a calendar. My calendar has all of my shows. I have a Google Calendar hooked up to the website that has all of my shows on the calendar. So as those come up, I keep posting them on there, and so I'm always around. I try to get around as much as possible. I'm hoping to get to a point where people start inviting me to these conventions so that I don't have to pay my way as much as I am currently. Need to get to that point where people are paying me to show up to these things.
Brilliant. Well, it's been lovely having you on the show, JP. So
thank you
very much for coming on. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't believe so. I mean, like I said, I'm always better with answering questions than if you let me ramble, I will go on for a very long time about all manner of nonsense.
That's fine. We don't mind rambling here.